Welcome back. Lecture 2 of this unit involves the female reproductive system. We covered the male reproductive system in lecture 1. So now we are moving on to females, and the first part of this is a little bit of review back when we were discussing meiosis at the beginning of the third marking period. So we discussed the difference between male and female gamete production. Gametes, of course, meaning sex cells. And we talked about how males produce gametes constantly. Once they hit puberty, their hormone levels remain high. They just keep producing sperm at a constant rate, producing hundreds of thousands, storing them all until they're no longer of any use, and then they are either ejaculated or discarded. Females have all of their potential eggs already in the ovaries by the time they're born. So the first part of meiosis happens while they're in utero, while they're developing embryos. It actually happens fairly early on in the gestation process, which we'll talk about in our lecture 3. And then the second difference is that male gametes go through the meiosis process in one motion. So they go through meiosis 1 and then immediately go through meiosis 2, and then the sperms mature. And then the germ cells again will go through meiosis 1, they'll go through meiosis 2, and you have immature sperm. Females, their eggs, after meiosis 1, the potential eggs that they're born with are stored in the ovaries, and they do not go through the second meiotic division until they are fertilized. So most of a female's eggs throughout her body are never going to go through that second meiotic division. Most of them are going to be released at a certain time during the ovarian cycle and will not be fertilized and will then be discarded. Now this right here, down at the bottom, is important when it comes to evolutionary purposes, because due to the fact that her eggs have been in this arrested or frozen state for at least decades. So from the time that she's born, meiosis 1 has already been completed. Meiosis 2 is only completed at fertilization, which means there are 10 to 20 to 30 years between meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. Well, the longer the eggs are in that frozen or arrested state, the more likely it is that there may be a problem with the second meiotic division. So we talked about something last unit about non-disjunction, where the chromosomes fail to separate during meiosis. That becomes more likely the longer the eggs are in that arrested state, which is why females go through menopause at a certain age. It's determined by her body at some point biologically that the eggs there's too much of a high likelihood that there is going to be a problem with meiosis, which means that will be passed down and there will be some kind of genetic disorder in the child. So, ovaries here and here, just like the testes in males, are the female reproductive organ. So, of course, we should all know by now that eggs, or ovum, are produced in the ovaries. But in addition to that, the ovaries are also producing the major sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. So in males, the testes produce testosterone. In females, the ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone. And each one of these hormones has a very specific role when it comes to the female cycle. Now I say cycle because every approximate 28 days, there are changes going on through the female body to prepare her body for the potential pregnancy. Eggs, or ova, are normally released approximately every 28 days. Now that can vary from female to female. It's not exactly 28 days. Sometimes it's slightly less, sometimes it's slightly more. But for the most part, female bodies are pretty good at maintaining that regular cycle because it's maintained by release of hormones. Ovulation is what we call the release of the egg from the ovaries. So typically, 1 month an egg will be released from this ovary, and then the next month an egg will be released from this ovary, and then it will swap back and forth meaning that only one egg is going to be released every 28 days. Now, this whole thing here is the female reproductive system viewed from the front. You've got the ovaries on either side, and each ovary is surrounded by a fallopian tube or oviduct. So another word for oviduct is fallopian tube. Now, if fertilization happens, it's going to happen in this area of the oviduct. And I'm going to talk more about that when we talk about fertilization and gestation in lecture 3, but just know that that's where it has to happen, because once the egg is released, it's only viable for about 72 hours, sometimes even less than that. So the average is about 48, but it can be fertilized up to 72 hours. If it's not fertilized, the egg travels through the oviduct into the uterus, which is this big muscle right here. This is the uterus, okay? And all of this tissue in this area is muscle. It's muscle because if there is a baby, when the baby or fetus is ready to be born, the uterine muscle actually has to contract to expel it out of the uterus. The bottom of the uterus is a very closed section of muscle called the cervix. That is the part, if you've ever heard the phrase dilation, when you're referring, like when someone's talking about being pregnant, they're saying a doctor might say they're dilated to 10. Well, that means that this part is actually, it widens up to 10 centimeters. And we're going to talk later about just how small 10 centimeters really is. And then below that is the vagina. The vagina is literally just an opening. It's a hole. That's the birth canal where the baby will actually come out. So, like I said just a minute ago, fertilization usually occurs in the oviduct. So here's the ovaries. All these big yellow things are follicles where the eggs are maturing. Just inside here, around this area, is where fertilization will have to take place, okay? And then you have the uterus here and the vagina, and when it says vent, that's the opening. 24 hours is pretty much how long the egg survives for. Like I said, it can survive for up to 72 hours, but the quicker it's fertilized, the more likely it is to be fertilized. So that's why it has to happen in the oviduct or fallopian tube, because it takes several days for the egg to get from the ovary to the uterus. So there's no real way that it can be fertilized by the time it gets there. It's already broken down. Now, the entire fallopian tube or oviduct is lined by cilia, which are hair-like structures. We talked about cilia in Unit 2. They're hair-like projections that just wave back and forth. And as they wave, they create a current. So inside the oviduct or the fallopian tube, there's a current that's moving the egg from the ovary to the uterus. Now, of course, because that current is moving towards the uterus, if you think about what sperm have to do, they've got to get to the egg in the oviduct. That means they're literally swimming upstream to get to the egg. So here are all the parts from the side view, okay? You've got ovary and the oviducts or fallopian tube, and the oviduct ends in some finger-like projections that just kind of surround the ovary, and they're able to create another current in order to get the egg from the ovary into the oviduct. Large muscle here is the uterus, and I say large muscle, it's large compared to the other parts of the female reproductive system. Closed opening down at the bottom called the cervix. You've got the birth canal, the vagina, and then the opening of the vagina down here, okay? The bladder, unlike with males, the bladder is like kind of right in the whole system, even though it's not actually part of the system. The bladder in females is in a different spot. So here's the bladder, and here is the urethra. So notice that the urethra is not part of the female reproductive system. Unlike males, where the urethra is actually where the sperm are ejaculated from, females' urethra is separate from the vaginal opening. The endometrium, this is a vocabulary word that you're going to have to know, that is a tissue lining that's surrounding this muscle, the uterus, and it's surrounding the opening right here, okay? So each month, that lining thickens in order to support an embryo if the female ends up pregnant. If the egg is fertilized and it implants in her uterus, that tissue supplies food and protection for the developing embryo in the early stages of gestation. Now, if there is no pregnancy, if there's no fertilization, what happens is that tissue is shed, and we call that menstruation. So, the actual ovarian cycle, like I said, approximately every 28 days, the female body goes through changes in order to prepare itself for pregnancy, because every single released egg is a potential pregnancy. Every time the female body releases an egg, that egg has the potential to be fertilized, and it has the potential to make an embryo and a fetus, and therefore a baby. So every single time a female goes through the cycle, it has to go through the preparations of, well, what if fertilization happens? What if there's a pregnancy? So that's what we call the ovarian cycle. Again, it takes approximately 28 days. Like I said, it can be slightly shorter with some women. It can be slightly longer with some women. Some women, their hormones are a little bit off balance, so there really isn't, like, they can tend to be a little bit irregular with their ovarian cycle, but it all depends on the actual female. The cycle, part of that cycle is the menstrual cycle, which is the part of that is actually preparing the uterus. Like I said, that endometrium, that uterine lining has to build up and get thicker every single ovarian cycle. And then if it doesn't need to be used, if there is no embryo, if there's no fertilization, then that endometrium needs to be released and gotten rid of. That's menstruation. So we have 4 phases. The first phase of the menstrual cycle is called the follicular phase. So hopefully you guys remember from last unit this hormone FSH. It's follicle stimulating hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone. Okay? That's what it's called, and I'm just going to erase that so this becomes easier to read. But that's what FSH is short for, follicle stimulating hormone. And hopefully you remember that males produce that exact same hormone from the pituitary glands at the beginning of puberty. So again, in males, follicle stimulating hormone starts to be released in males at puberty. It increases testosterone. Testosterone is what starts the sperm production, okay? And then from there, follicle stimulating hormone remains high in males basically throughout their entire life. Testosterone levels remain high basically through their entire life. They just keep making sperm at a regular rate. Follicle stimulating hormone in females does exactly what it sounds like. It stimulates or starts a growing follicle. And the follicles are the things in the ovaries that are holding the eggs, the immature eggs that were made during meiosis 1. So the follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, is produced by the pituitary. That's the gland in the brain that wakes up during puberty. And FSH levels increase. That causes the follicle to grow and mature. As the follicle is growing, it releases estrogen from the ovaries. What we call that is a positive feedback, okay? So your body uses feedback mechanisms all the time. Something goes up, it causes something else to go up, or something goes up, causes something else to go down. In this case, this is a positive feedback mechanism. FSH increases, it causes estrogen to increase. Now, an increase in estrogen going up, causes LH, that's the other hormone that we talked about. It's called the luteinizing hormone. Also in males, it's just doing something different here. The luteinizing hormone is stimulated by an increase in estrogen. So the increase in estrogen causes the LH to spike. It goes super, super high. And that spike in LH, that surge, causes something called ovulation, which is the release of the egg from the follicle. So the follicle ruptures and the egg is released and it's taken in by the fallopian tube or oviduct. That begins the luteal phase. The corpus luteum is what we call now the broken follicle. So like I said, the follicle is ruptured so the egg can be released. And then what's left over becomes these yellow cells that we call the corpus luteum that releases high amounts of progesterone and estrogen. Okay, so those are the two hormones that are released by the ovaries. More specifically, they're released by this thing called the corpus luteum. That makes the endometrium, that lining of the uterus, get super, super thick. Okay, the increase in progesterone and estrogen causes that lining to get very thick, full of blood, preparing for implantation or pregnancy. Now that lining starts increasing because of the increase in estrogen back here. Okay, so it starts increasing here, but it gets really, really thick here because of the progesterone and estrogen together. Menstruation happens when the corpus luteum, those cells, that broken follicle, begins to break down. It stops producing progesterone and estrogen. So these progesterone and estrogen, they levels decrease, and because they're decreasing, particularly because of the decrease in this here progesterone, the lining of the uterus starts to break off and is shed, and that's what we call menstruation. That's what you call it when a female has her period. It's all of that lining that's full of blood and tissue is being shed from the uterus in order to start the whole cycle over again. And then because of these low levels of progesterone and estrogen, guess what happens? Goes all the way back to the beginning, and FSH starts being produced again from the pituitary gland. So you'll notice that the hormone levels in males and females is vastly different. Even though they're technically working off the same hormones, FSH and LH, male hormone levels just remain high at all times from puberty throughout basically the rest of their years, because like I said, they can essentially have children theoretically until they die. Females, their hormones are at a constant increase, decrease, increase, decrease, increase, decrease, based on what part of their cycle they're in, which is what causes those things called like mood swings, and it's what causes them to get crabby, and it actually causes physical reactions. So things like cramps, if you've ever heard a female say that she has cramps, well, guess what? During menstruation, the uterus actually begins to contract similarly to the way that it does during childbirth. So if a female says she has cramps, it's actually because the uterus is contracting in an attempt to get rid of all of that lining. So it's not just, oh, I'm running and I can't, I'm not breathing very well, so I get that stitch in my side. That's not what she means by cramps, okay? What she means by cramps is that her uterus actually is contracting, and it sometimes can cause severe pain. So this is just a nice little chart showing the increase and decrease of the hormones throughout the course of, throughout the course of the ovarian cycle. So number one, here, pituitary gland releases FSH. We just talked about that. So FSH levels go up. They don't have to go up by much, okay? But they go up. And that causes the follicle here. So here's one follicle with one immature egg, and it starts to grow and grow, okay? While that's happening, that's two, the follicle begins to grow. Because of this mature follicle, it is releasing estrogen, and estrogen levels here go up. And that right there, this high estrogen level here is what causes this to happen. Look at this blue spike up here. So LH levels remain fairly stable until estrogen levels start going up, and then it peaks. It spikes super, super high. And this spike here is what causes ovulation. It's what causes the follicle to rupture and release that egg. Okay, now I'm going to go all the way down to the bottom here. Notice that when this estrogen level starts to go up, the endometrium starts to get thicker. You have thicker tissue, you have more blood vessels, you have thicker blood vessels. So now we're at ovulation, the egg has been released, and now this follicle, this broken follicle, becomes the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum releases estrogen, which goes up a little, and progesterone, which goes up a lot. Now, progesterone is the hormone that's actually responsible for maintaining this endometrium. So if progesterone levels remain high, that endometrium is not going to shed. It's going to stay there. And like I said, we're going to discuss that more when we talk about in lecture 3, fertilization and gestation. So the corpus luteum first is releasing higher levels of estrogen and progesterone, but then it begins to break down. It gets smaller and smaller, and what happens? Progesterone levels, they tank, and because of those low progesterone levels, the endometrium is shed, and that is the actual part of menstruation, okay? And then the low levels of progesterone and estrogen cause another increase in FSH, which causes the entire cycle to start all over again. Now, this cycle will go on throughout an entire female's life until she reaches menopause, which is where the ovarian and menstrual cycles stop, okay? FSH and LH stop being produced. That means that estrogen and progesterone levels are going to remain low. And like I said at the beginning of this lecture, the longer a female goes between meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, the more likely there will be some kind of fault in meiosis 2, meaning the chromosomes failing to separate, which means that after a while, there is much more likelihood of genetic abnormalities, of passing on things like Down syndrome or Klinefelter syndrome or Turner syndrome, things like that. So what does a female body do in order to prevent those kinds of things? At a certain age, her hormone levels just drop, and then she's no longer able to get pregnant. So that is the female reproductive system, a little more complicated than the male reproductive system in terms of hormones, but you have a worksheet to complete on the female reproductive system. Again, just like with the male reproductive system, it's going to be graded based on completion. I will be posting a key to that once you have all turned it in. And then on Friday of this week, we'll be getting into fertilization and gestation. That lecture is going to be a little bit longer because there's much more to it than that, but I will try to keep it as brief as possible.